Welcome, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of Love Does Not Hurt, a conversation about intimate partner violence awareness. My name is Dr. Nancy Slater, and I'm pleased that you have joined us for part 2 of this workshop. If you remember from part 1, we discussed the definitions of intimate partner violence, formerly known as domestic violence. We discussed how this affected the victims who domestic violence affects, and this includes neighbors and friends and relatives and co-workers and the children involved and the neighbors and the American taxpayer, as we discussed. We talked about the traits of the perpetrator, the abusive personality. We talked about how domestic violence is a very financial effect and also a permanent effect on children. If you remember correctly, we stated in part 1 that if children are raised in an abusive relationship, they are 3 times more likely to become abusers in adulthood, because that is what has been modeled for them, and that is what they believe is the appropriate behavior, because it was modeled by family members and by parents. In this part 2, I'm going to use screen save as best I can so that I'll be able to share the handouts with you, the information with you better. The monitor I used in part 1 was not very successful for you being able to read these words and see the power and control wheels that I have used. Now, if you remember, if you email Psalm 31 ministries at gmail.com, I will be happy to send you a PDF of the booklet, Love Does Not Hurt. So let's look at tonight's screenshot. And we are going to begin tonight or begin this session where we left off in session 1. And I showed you another power and control wheel, but around the outer edge, we're seeing the types of abuse that are used in intimate partner violence, and they are described in detail. These include intellectual abuse, finance abuse, damage and abuse to pets, and also physical property. We have had victims call the crisis line and say he's thrown all of, or he or she has thrown all of my possessions out into the yard and I have no place to go. I am seeking shelter. There's also damage to rental units, breaking of glass, breaking of furniture. It's all part of the power and control. The next one is psychological abuse, and this is working on the emotions, the thought process. Physical abuse is easy to understand. Verbal abuse is easy to understand. It's a little harder to believe, quite frankly, because there are no scars and bruises to show, to prove what has happened. There's no way to open our brain and describe and prove the damage that has been done. Sexual abuse, I mentioned in part 1 that marital rape is really a thing that does occur quite often in power and control situations. There's spiritual abuse, where a person's faith or lack of faith becomes a weapon to be used. And with that abuse or demanding that a specific verse in the Bible or a specific part of the Quran or specific parts of other sacred texts be used, be memorized, or be ignored, the victim then is questioning their faith, questioning if God really does exist, questioning what has happened to them. the use of children as weapons, as pawns in this game of power and control, social abuse, what happens in our society, different affiliations that we might have in organizations that we belong to may become weapons and pawns as well. Using culture, and I'm working up the left side of the circle, as a weapon. What if two individuals from different cultures have united in a relationship? There's difficulties blending those cultures together to create a harmonious environment. And one culture could certainly use another culture as a weapon, as something hurtful, as something that becomes shameful in the hands of the perpetrator. And then we have emotional abuse there at the end. I want to lower my screen here. There we go. I appreciate your patience while I learn all these technical steps. And there's a list of the types of abuse. Since we're talking about types of abuse, then I want to stop here at gaslighting. What is gaslighting? That's certainly something that you may have heard about. There was a movie in the late 1930s, early 1940s, all about gaslighting. But according to Dr. Nye Preston, and this is from his article, which is included in the reference in the booklet and at the last of this part two, gaslighting is a form of persistent manipulation and brainwashing. Oh my goodness, it sounds a little more serious than just emotional or verbal abuse. This is manipulation and brainwashing that is persistent, and it causes the victim to doubt themselves, to ultimately lose their sense of perception, identity, and self worth. What am I talking about? What is Dr. Preston talking about? So let me give you an example of gaslighting. We'll use a female victim, a female partner in this marriage. Every night when she comes home from work, she leaves her keys in a dish on the entry table door, and then goes about, leaving her work clothes, changing clothes, starting dinner, whatever her next routine is. The husband in this relationship is and has been using gaslighting, and he's been doing it more frequently, more persistently. And so, one of the things he does on this particular evening is take her car keys, go to the bedroom, their bedroom, her bedroom, whatever, while she's in the kitchen, and puts her car keys in her underwear drawer, comes back out, they have dinner, and there's an ingredient missing for dinner. And so he suggests that they go out to dinner, and let's take your car because you've just been home a few minutes. The car is nice and warm. So they go to the entry table. The keys are missing. He says, well, what did you do with your keys when you came home? I put them in the dish. I'm almost sure of it. Well, let's start a look. So they look in her purse, they look in her coat pockets, they look around the house. They finally wander down to the bedroom. They're looking through dresser drawers. He opens the underwear drawer, miraculously finds the keys, pulls them out, and says, what on earth were you thinking when you put the keys in this drawer? She's panic stricken. A sense of perception is lost. I don't remember putting them in the drawer. I don't think I put them in the drawer. I remember doing the entry table. I remember going to the kitchen. I don't remember. Now, if that's repeated multiple times a week, you can well imagine what is happening within her thought process. This inequitable power dynamic, these are Dr. Preston's words, and microaggression or mind control can cause the victim to question the validity of their thoughts, the reality of their memories, and events occurring around them, even their own sanity. Now, if this is happening 3 or 4 times a week, 2 or 3 times a week when she's coming home from work, and then multiplying by her coffee cup, her glasses, the evening newspaper, the magazine she was reading, you can well see how gaslighting takes clever manipulation. It takes planning to keep doing this over and over again. Dr. Preston calls this microaggression. What do we mean by that? If someone grabs you by the throat and throws you up against the wall, that is macroaggression. That's large. But this is micro. It's tiny steps affecting the emotional and psychological standards and thought process of the victim. Preston lists 7 steps, and they are lie and exaggerate, repetition, escalating when challenged. In other words, if the wife said, "You're doing this to me. Why are you doing this to me?" We know from the abusive personality, they will accept no responsibility. And so there is an argument, and then there's going to be an escalation and a different technique used. So the victim is worn out. They form codependency after a period of time. Their thinking is, I'm not even capable of taking care of myself. I'm not even sure I can get to work and do my job. I'm not sure what's going on, but maybe this is early dementia or Alzheimer's. And so then the loving husband is stepping in to take over more control and to take care of this poor soul who is not capable of taking care of themselves. It gives false hope, and there's dominance and control in this situation. 2 other terms I want you to focus on, and I'll talk about them. Intimate terrorism. Intimate terrorism is a phrase that was developed during the early stages of the pandemic when we were in lockdown, when we were bound to our houses. You can well imagine what it was like for a victim to be trapped in their home with the abuser, unable to go to the grocery store, unable to go shopping, unable to go out of the house because the government and the CDC were saying, please save your life. This virus is killing people, so you must stay indoors. And here these people were trapped with their abuser. And so those that were researching violence, intimate partner violence at that time, came up with this term. This is intimate terrorism. In other words, 24/7 of terror, where perhaps before the abusive personality was going off to work, there was at least some calm time. The other term that I want you to focus on, and I've taken off the screen share, is toxic triangulation. All right, picture this triangle. At the top of the triangle is the victim. At this corner of the triangle, your right, is the perpetrator, the abuser. And at the left triangle point is family and friends. So the perpetrator will say to family and friends, your daughter or your son is absolutely crazy They are driving me crazy with their behavior. I do not know what is wrong with them mentally, but I just want to. And they've also said hideous and horrible things about you that I know are false. So he says to the, or she, sorry, says to the victim, I spoke with your family last week. They said some of the most cruel and disrespectful things about you. And because of that, I do not want you to speak to them anymore. I want you just to rely on me because I'm the one that loves you. And please stay away from them. Stay away from your friends. They're being rude and disrespectful behind your back. That is toxic triangulation. And it's also a way to keep a person isolated. Let's talk about warning signs. I'm not I'm not going to list them for you. There are quite a few that I can send you, but I will speak them to you. Being overly romantic. We saw that in the honeymoon wheel and in the abusive wheel. Unreasonably jealous. Remember that the abusive personality trait believes that jealousy is a way to form love, to show love. And so being unreasonably jealous in their mind is showing much mega love, if you will. Isolation from friends and family. That makes a sense if you're trying to understand abuse, because it's a way, if a victim cannot leave the world that the abuser has created, the house, or just associating with the abuser, they're much easier to control. If a victim is allowed to go to work, it's more difficult for them to be controlled because they are out of sight, not out of mind of the abuser, of the abusive personality, but out of sight. The won't take no for an answer. So if family or friends or the victim wants to say no to an abuser, absolutely not required. There's controlling behavior. Some of these warning signs can be seen easily by friends and family and coworker, but can't be recognized easily in the beginning of an abusive relationship. Of course, we survivors can look back into our relationships and say, oh, yes, I get that now. Yeah, all the warning signs were there. I just didn't know there were warning signs, and I didn't know what to look for. Manipulation. These abusers are brilliant manipulators. And if you watch them as an observer and an outside observer, you will see, oh, there's so much manipulation going on here. I think maybe my friend or my relative is being abused. And then, of course, there is the psychological abuse and the manipulation and the emotional abuse. All right, let me bring up the screensaver again. And we will lower this down. We'll skip over the warning signs slowly so you can see them written. Let's talk about dispelling myths. What do I mean by that? I find that in order to understand things that happen in our world, we must explain them. Our minds want to make sense out of them. And this is what has happened in domestic violence and intimate partner violence. It is so difficult to understand. It is so difficult to explain that over the centuries, over the last couple of 100 years, then myths have been created to answer away or explain away what is going on behind closed doors. And we know it's none of our business what is going on behind closed doors. We're not supposed to pay attention. And so um, let's talk about the myths. We'll talk about one of the laws later. So the first thing that I write here is when speaking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, it is critical to speak truth and facts and not myths or antiquated falsehoods. And remember, the battered women's movement started in the mid 1970s. And so there were things prior to the 1970s that were explained away. So one of those, domestic violence is rare. Well, maybe that was a good thought in 1970, but we know today that 1 in 3 women and nearly 1 in 4 men have experienced this abuse and violence in their lifetime. So it's not rare. Another myth. Domestic violence only happens to women who are poor, uneducated, and from a minority community. I am embarrassed to admit that until the late 1970s, that is exactly what I thought. That if you only had an 8th grade education, you came from a very, 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 very poor family, and you lived in a very, very, very poor community, then that's the abuse was happening because those victims didn't know any better. Well, I've learned the hard way that that is absolutely not true. The problem is not really violence against women. I'm trying to get my screen down here. You guys are so patient with me. The problem is really not violence against women, it's spouse abuse. Women are just as violent as men. Well, in 1980 or whenever this statement was written, maybe that was true, but we know that we have female perpetrators. Are they just as violent as men? How are we going to rate that? Are they just as abusive as men? Yes. As violent? I'm not sure we can say that. We know that they have less upper body strength than men, generally speaking. So a male perpetrator can hurt a victim easier with his physical strength. Women cannot hurt physically, but they certainly can use psychological, emotional, gaslighting, toxic triangulation. And so I dispel this myth. It shouldn't even be something we discuss. Another myth, which we still hear today, women can make changes in their behavior toward their partner that will make the violence stop. No, we've all tried and it didn't work. There was just something else to be angry about. If we burnt the toast and we were harmed because of it, and we no longer burnt the toast, I can guarantee you it was because the mashed potatoes were runny, or the coffee was too cold, or dinner was too late. So women can't really stop violence, I'm sorry to say, even though we victims would certainly want to. People who use violence to control their partners are mentally ill. No. Some maybe, but we cannot blame this behavior on mental illness. This is not mental illness. Remember, violence is based on attitudes and behavior and learned behavior and emotions, not on mental illness. So That is a myth that may explain some situations, but it certainly doesn't explain them all. And I'm just not willing to explain away intimate partner violence with mental illness. Let's finish this page. Women in violent relationships usually refuse to leave. We talked in part one why a victim stays. It isn't that they want to stay, it's because there are reasons, usually not refuse to leave. There are economic reasons. They have custody of the children they've been threatened with. There's all kinds of other reasons. So I don't quite think that this is an appropriate statement to make. The community places responsibility for domestic violence on the person who commits the crime. They very rarely do. Perpetrators are not always held accountable, and we must look at how those perpetrators were raised. This is a societal issue and a general issue for all cultures and communities. Drugs and alcohol cause abusive behavior? No, they may not help it, but they certainly don't cause it. No. And finally, I'll go back up here. People who perpetrate domestic violence just snap and lose control. Therefore, they need anger management. We know that anger management classes and treatment does not work. It's not the reason for power and control. They can control their anger perfectly. A perpetrator manipulates, and a perpetrator can control his or her anger in public because they are out there being a chameleon and doing what is expected of them. They need behavior retraining. They need emotional to learn how to control their emotions, and they need attitude adjustments. It's not just anger management. And also, the final myth is they just must like it. Well, you can imagine now in where you are in workshop training that uh, that you know that none of us, none of us would choose to have our lives threatened, to have our families threatened, to have our children harmed, to have our bodies beat and bruised and attacked, to have our minds warped, to live through gaslighting, to live through stalking, to live through strangulation. No, it's not that we like that at all. We are just in a situation that snuck up on us, I will say. I tell the story of how do you boil a frog? You boil a frog 1 degree at a time. So imagine yourself in a hot tub in your backyard, and you've got your glass of sweet tea or your adult beverage in your hand, and you're just in the water, and it's comfortable and warm, and the jets are fixing your sore knees and the calves, and you're just relaxing. What if somebody else was controlling the temperature of the hot tub and they were moving it up 1 degree at a time? When would you find out you were in trouble? When the water was boiling and it was too late to get out of the hot tub. So I just want to dispel that myth too, that remember in the first workshop, we said that we fall in love with the representative of who that person really is. So let's go back now to our screen share, and we'll lower the page down and we'll talk a little bit about double abuse. What is that? How can that happen? Double abuse, and you'll see at the top of this page, there is a copyright mark after this term. Annette Altmans developed this term in her MEND project, and she uses this iceberg analogy to explain double abuse. And it occurs, it is so common that it's frightening. So let's look at the top of the iceberg. We know from our classes in school, geography study and science, that when we see an iceberg in the Antarctic or in the Arctic, we're only seeing a small portion of it that's above the waterline. So this is the original abuse. It's the psychological abuse, it's the sexual abuse, it's the professional sabotage that happens, it's bullying, it's child abuse. Whatever abuse is going on above the water is what happens initially. Now let's look below the waterline. We actually see the size of this iceberg, and here is where double abuse occurs. So this is so typical when a victim is telling a therapist or telling a medical person who has not been trained to be aware of domestic violence, or is telling the courts, or is telling the attorney, or is telling the judge, or is telling her employer why she has missed so much work. This is where the double abuse occurs. It's criticizing. It's pulling away. How many families and friends have pulled away from someone who is involved in an abusive situation? It's making ultimatums. If you don't leave the abuser now, we will never help you again. We will never help you financially. We will never talk to you. We know that the victim leaves when the time is right for them. Remember from part one, 50% of the DV homicides happen when the victim is trying to escape. So ultimatums is another form of abuse. Placing conditions is another form of abuse. Yes, I will help you, but you have to get a job. You have to do better. You will let you in the shelter, but you have to stop your drug abuse. You can't use alcohol. You can't smoke in our shelter. You can't. Placing conditions. It's shunning a person, turning away from them as if they were lepers. It's limiting the scope of conversation and help. It's asking pointed questions. You said there was marital rape. Describe it to me in detail so I can fully understand it. No, that's abusive. That's something that's asking the victim to bring up something that he or she does not ever want to think about it again. Not believing, giving unrequired advice. That's the last thing we need to do. Not hearing a judge situation, the judge not hearing the victim's voice, but appreciating the perpetrator's voice, judging. It's a terrible thing. Double abuse is an absolute terrible thing that happens. And it still happens commonly in our society, in our public offices, you can imagine landlords that are trying to keep someone in a rental situation. They don't care if they're being abused or not. It's a terrible thing, and I appreciate Ms. Altman's even describing this and copywriting it so we would know how to describe double abuse. All right. So here is, as we're coming closer to the end of our second session, I bring these two wheels to you. I tried to make them as large as possible so that you could read them, but they really need to be on separate pages. But on one side, we have the love of power. And on the other side, we have the power of love. What a contrast. And I wanted to show you the left circle, the love of power, that greed, that wanting more and more and more power, more and more and more control. That greed is so damaging, as you have witnessed and as you have heard in part one and also in part two. But let's look at the power of love. And I'll read to you. In the love of power, we use intimidation. In the power of love, we use non threatening behavior. On the next pie, using emotional abuse in the love of power, but in the power of love, using respect. Using isolation in the love of power, but using trust and support in the power of love. Isn't that remarkable? The victim who is isolated, who can't go to work, who can't go to school and improve himself or herself, who is isolated. Can you imagine what a joy it would be if they discovered someone who trusted and supported them? You want to go back to school to learn a trade? You want to go back to school to complete your bachelor's degree? I would love for you to do that. I will support you. I will trust you to be on campus or doing it online, whatever works best for you. That's the power of love. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. This is down in the bottom right pie chart. Minimizing. Instead, in the power of love, we use honesty and accountability. Going over, using children, abusing those children, and in the power of love, using responsible parenting. Using male privilege or using female privilege, as we discussed, is both can be used. In the power of love, we're sharing responsibility. Using economic abuse, I'm on the upper left now. Instead, in the power of love, using economic partnership. How wonderful would that be? Where there's writing budgets and setting spending limits and saving for a new house or saving for a vacation or saving for a new car together. The power of love. Using coercion or threats, I'm at the top left now. Negotiating and fairness. In the power of love, there's going to be arguments. There's going to be conflict. But there's a way to work through those things through negotiation and fairness, through mediation instead of manipulation. So what can we do? We're moving toward the end now. You know all about domestic violence. You know all about intimate partner violence and the damage that it does and the damage it can do to those people exposed to it. So, what can you do? You are now aware. You know so much more than you did at the beginning of part one when I introduced myself and said, "Hi, I'm Nancy Slater. let me tell you some stuff that is not very pleasant. And that's why I wanted to use the contrast, the love of power and the power of love that leads us now into this awareness portion of this workshop. Put your awareness to work. How can you do that? You can become an advocate, a change agent. What does that mean? Become a voice against violence. Watch for the warning signs of DV, IPV in your friends and family members, in your children. Reach out in friendship and empathy. Try not to be intrusive, but just say, I think something's not right, and I'm concerned. I'm here when you want to talk about it, when you want to share what's going on, when you maybe want to do some safety planning. I'm here. I will not blame. I will not shame. I will not criticize. I don't quite understand what's going on, but here's my hand of friendship. It's here when you're ready to take it. Empathy. Learn how to safely help victims and seek those victims who seek help. Do a personalized safety plan. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, ncadv.org, has a wonderful personalized safety plan on their website. Download it, print it, and help the victim, soon to be survivor, fill it out so that he or she can safely leave. Do some research. Don't just rely on what I have said to you. Visit your state coalition against domestic violence. There are 50 of them. See what services are offered in your community. Google domestic violence shelters, domestic violence agencies, men stopping violence. Google and see what's around. In the resources page, there are several national coalitions that I gave you, websites and links to, so that you could do more research. Find out more. See what you can do. Become familiar with community-based agencies. If your friend that you offered to help just a few days ago says, I'm ready to leave, tell me what to do, you better be prepared. Yes, I can send you to A, B, or C agency. I think they might be able to help. I'm with you. I can meet you in a safe place. Consider becoming a volunteer. All these nonprofits love to train volunteers and have volunteers help. I've been a volunteer since 2006, a year after I left the abusive marriage. And why? Because I wanted to know more and I wanted to do more. I wanted to give back. Once I was safe and healthy again, I wanted to do more. I wanted to help those others who felt trapped where they were. Study family law in your state and determine what's going on. What needs to be changed? What needs to be improved? Look at what you don't like and then advocate for changing that law. Make sure that your state laws honor the voice of the victim and not just the perpetrator. Perpetrators, we can pray for them, we can help them, we can send them to treatment, but they need to be held accountable. And until they are accountable for their actions, they are not going to be willing to make any changes that are necessary in their attitudes and in their behaviors. I'm going to go back to screen share again now. And I'm going to go down. Well, what can you do? Those are the words that I just spoke. I want to remind you that awareness can facilitate change. And what does that mean? I've got three wheels with spokes and with rims here in this particular article. On the left is the power and control wheel that we are so familiar, right? In the middle is an advocacy wheel. And on the right is the equality wheel. And so when you are aware of an issue and when your awareness wants to make some changes, then this is what is going to happen. Things will go from power and control through advocacy and into equality. Let's look at advocacy for a minute. Here's an advocacy wheel. And it says in the center, advocacy. Advocates show respect and they honor confidentiality. They believe and validate the experiences of what the victim is saying, even though they don't understand it, even though they don't want to hear it. I hear you, I believe you, I validate what you are saying. They acknowledge the injustice. They respect the victim. They help plan. They promote access to community services. And we're back at the top, respect confidentiality. And why should we respect confidentiality? Because the victim has to go into hiding. There's still an abuser out there. And unless the abuser is in treatment or incarcerated or has moved out of state, the victim needs to be protected and her location needs to be confidential. An advocate is also an ally. An advocate or ally allows the victim to rediscover their voice and the ability to make their own decisions. Why is that so important? Victims do not have a voice. They are told to shut up, sit down, be quiet, you're dumb, you're stupid, you're not worth anything. They don't have a voice. They've lost their voice. And they don't make decisions in an abusive relationship. The decisions are made by the perpetrator. So they get to learn to make their own decisions. Slowly, but they do. An advocate is empathetic, encouraging, understanding. An advocate hears the victim's story and really listens. Why do I put that there? You know, we were created with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in the proportions that we were created with. 1 mouth, 2 ears. Listen, hear, really hear what the victim is saying. An advocate does not give advice or tell the victim what to do. That's what the abuser did for months and years. An advocate makes suggestions and provides opportunities so the victim can choose what is best for them. What is best for them? So when we advocate at the shelter, we might give them 3 or 4 options. When they first come to us, we'll say, would you like a cup of coffee or a glass of water, a bottle of water? And they look at us like, I get to decide which one I want. Maybe they will say, I'd like orange juice. And we can say, great, we'll get you some orange juice. And they've made their first decision. We can say, would you like to go to your room and unpack and then come to the office and do paperwork? Or would you like to do the paperwork now and then settle in? Wow, I get to choose between those two things. So we more and more, day after day after day, give them suggestions, give them opportunities, help them make decisions. And then when they're transitioning into their transitional housing or into their own apartments, they're well practiced. They've learned now that they do have a voice, and have they've grown up. They've become adults. An advocate guides the victim to the right agency and professionals and helps them get the help they need. Do you need food stamps? Do you need childcare? Do you need TANF? Do you need therapy, counseling? Do we need to get you to a doctor? Do you need medical care or dental care? We can help do that. And finally, and maybe the most importantly, an advocate acknowledges the injustice of the abuse. And it's okay to be angry. It's okay to show your anger to a victim and say, I am so sorry. And that was so wrong. And you did nothing wrong. And you didn't deserve anything that happened to you. So here's another advocacy wheel, and it has a little bit different things, respect privacy and so forth, helping them make a plan. But it talks a little more about the art of listening. Storytelling is something that we have learned from our ancestors, from the Native Americans who were here, from those cultures that only had an oral history. We have understood the importance of storytelling, and we've understood in the intimate partner violence movement and therapies that telling the story is a proven method of healing and reducing the effects of trauma and reducing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So what do we mean by that? We mean that when we tell our story as a victim, a new survivor, and that trauma and that hurt and that pain that we've been carrying around in our gut, in our midsection, comes out through our voice, and we hear those in our storytelling circle or in our support group circle. Oh, you are so brave to have survived that. Oh, good for you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being brave. Wow. I can feel those positive affirmations from someone else, and I am taking them into my inner being and filling up the hole that was left by the storytelling, and that hole that was left by the trauma, and that is reducing my PTSD. It's an amazing thing. And as we tell our stories, there's less pain and there's less emotion involved. And what we are doing is doing a testimony, speaking from the faith community. Because when I tell my story, then I'm inspiring someone else to tell their story. Or they can look at me and say, wow, she survived. She got out of there. She survived being strangled. She survived having her nose broken. She survived PTSD. She survived being stalked for 18 months. Wow, look at her. I can do it too. That's why storytelling is so powerful as a healing tool and as a tool to help others. That doesn't mean we have to carry that label of victim around on our shoulders for the rest of our lives. No, because as we tell our stories, we become survivors, we become thrivers, and we are no longer victim speaking. We are empowering others. It's critical to understand the effects of trauma on all those who have experienced DV and IPV. And trauma is handled in many different ways. There's a new term from 2022 research paper, and it's called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And they're looking at victims of domestic violence and their children, and also looking at those who have been in war zones, and realizing it's not just PTSD, but it's complex PTSD when this trauma and this violence have repeated over and over and over again, and they've been unsafe for so long. It's complex, and it requires a different type of therapy, and perhaps a longer therapy. If no one listens, no one values their story, healing is delayed. Victims become survivors and thrivers when they learn the power of their voice. Ben Hesher said, to inspire people, don't show them your superpowers, show them theirs. So as advocates also, we have to be very careful that we're not throwing our experience and stories into the mix. It's important that we hear their story. And so V is for voice. V used to be for victim, but in this case, V is for voice. All right. We are at the end of this particular workshop. And the last thing I want to put in your mind to consider, open up for discussion. And you have my email, Psalm 31 Ministries, and that 31 is the number 31, not spelled out 31. Psalm 31 Ministries at gmail.com. Let's brainstorm. Send me your questions. I will respond to you. I don't have all the answers, but I do have responses. Send me your comments. Send me your critiques. We can't get better in this movement unless we know your opinions and your suggestions. And so prevention, for years, the battered women's movement, the domestic violence movement, the Me Too movement has put Band-Aids and splints and casts on this issue. And we've really not thought about until most recently prevention. What does prevention look like? How can we stop this? I work for an agency whose name is Women's Resource Center to End Domestic Violence. In the 70s, and I've volunteered at 3 agencies, so I know each one of them in the 70s when they were founded knew New Beginnings in Seattle, for example, the agency that saved my life, only had a 30-year plan, only had a 20-year plan, because they knew that with the hard work they were doing, they could eradicate domestic violence in 20 or 30 years. That was before we really knew what it was, that it's a generational thing. So think about what we can do to prevent it. Let's look at the causes and establish methods of prevention. One of the causes is generational. We know that children raised in abusive homes are 3 times more likely to become abusers as adults than their peers. So what does that mean? That means one generation taught the other generation how to behave. It is generational. I've gone back in my generation, my family, for 5 generations. My mother was emotionally abused. My grandmother was abused. Her mother was abused emotionally. psychologically and probably physical. Her mother was abused. You know, in the mid 1850s, that's what we did. That's what society said was okay. You're in charge behind closed doors, do what you have to do. There was the rule of thumb that, believe it or not, when it was put into law in the late 1800s, stayed in the mid 1800s, stayed as a law in a state that borders the state that I'm in now until the early 1900s. The rule of thumb. A husband could beat his wife with a stick as long as it was no bigger than his thumb. So, of course, there was family violence, domestic violence in the 1800s, in the 1900s. And of course, it was generational because we teach our generation how to behave, our children how to behave. So what does prevention look like? I have no scientific proof that this will work. But since I've been an advocate since 2006, 7, 8, this is what I've been saying. If we as a country, we as a nation, we as the world, we as the community, we as a state, take our 2-year-olds and raise them not in little girl boxes and little boy boxes, but in little people. Raise them as little people, little individuals. And we train them to control their emotions, to mediate rather than manipulate. That screaming and shouting and beating your fists and kicking your feet, falling on the floor and kicking your feet is not good behavior. That taking deep breaths, 10 deep breaths, walking away from the situation, coming back, talking about the issues, listening, communicating, mediating. How many generations would it take then for domestic violence to disappear? I estimate 3. If we started today with our 2-year-olds. But I want to talk more about prevention. I'd love to have enough suggestions from the people that attend and watch and listen to this workshop that we could have a whole workshop session just on prevention mechanisms. With this attitude, with your awareness, with your action, with your advocacy, with your effort to make a phone call, to write a letter to those who you have elected to represent you. Way back in the day when my boys were little, I wrote a letter to our local legislator about an issue about an unsafe traffic area that was hurting children on their way to school. And I was angry about it and I was incensed. And so I wrote a letter. And he told me every letter that the legislature received, they knew represented 250 voters that maybe agreed with us, but did not write. So a text, a phone call, a letter can make a huge difference in changing laws, in changing attitudes, and in voting new people in if you don't like the laws that they have passed. Prevention is the next step. Advocacy, action, understanding. If we do all of this, we literally draw a line in the sand on which we can build a concrete wall that will prevent abuse and end the generational curse that is called the battered women's movement, the domestic violence movement, the Me Too movement, the intimate partner violence movement. We can stop it. if we work hard enough. 3 generations. Perhaps we can do it in 2 generations. I don't know. But I encourage you to do that. I have one last screenshot to share with you. And as I say, these are also, these pages are included in the booklet. So email me and get your copy. But here are the resources, a resource list that I have made for you. The personalized safety plan, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence.org. The National Network to End Domestic Violence is also a wonderful website for great information. My state, the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, has a website and resource and training that they offer free on their website. The Washington State Coalition, wonderful, and so is the Nevada Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I participated in all 3 of those organizations and was a member and a workshop presenter at the Washington State Coalition. There's Interfaith Partnership or Safe Haven website, Faith Trust Institute website, an organization in Seattle that has combined all the faiths to work together to bring domestic violence awareness and domestic violence training to the faith community. We Will Speak Out is also a great organization, and they did surveys of pastors and church leaders in 2014 and 2018, which made a huge difference in how pastors approached domestic violence and talking about it and treating and helping the victims and holding perpetrators responsible. Men Stopping Violence is wide organization. The Women's Resource Center to End Domestic Violence is the agency that I work for here in Georgia. The Men Project, the link to the double abuse, and their Preston's link to the article that he wrote on gaslighting. And that brings to an end our second session on intimate partner violence awareness. I thank you so much for your attention. I thank you for your patience as I fumbled with the mouse and the screen and screen sharing. Again, my name is Dr. Nancy Slater. I'm the founder and manager, CEO of Psalm 31 Ministries. And Psalm 31 Ministries has been my go-to for all my public appearances and workshops. You can email me at psalm31ministries@gmail.com with questions, comments, and a copy of the booklet for this evening. Again, I appreciate you. I wish you well in your awareness study and in your advocacy, because I know you will make a difference in your community.